I'd like to welcome our first guest, Eileen Fitzgerald. Eileen is head of housing affordability philanthropy at the Wells Fargo Foundation. She joined the Wells Foundation in 2019 after a 25-year career in the community development, nonprofit, and housing industry. In 2019, Wells Fargo unveiled an evolution to its philanthropy strategy, including a commitment of $1 billion through 2025 to address the U.S. housing affordability crisis and bring solutions for availability and affordability of rental homes, sustainable home ownership, and homelessness. Most recently, Eileen served as president and chief executive officer of Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, a collaborative of nonprofits that collectively owns and operates more than 140,000 affordable rental homes nationwide. Prior to that, Eileen served as chief executive officer and chief operating officer with NeighborWorks California. Eileen, thank you so much for joining us today, all the way from Washington, D.C. To start off with, can you maybe tell us a little bit about your work with Wells Fargo Foundation, Housing Affordability Philanthropy, and how you see that work evolving or changing to respond to COVID-19?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me today. It's really exciting to know that more than 1,000 people are participating in this virtual conference, and hopefully from my end, everything's working. So
sound great and look great.
Turn off my video because I was so nervous about that. But anyhow, we're really excited at Wells Fargo to bring our philanthropy to bear in this COVID-19 crisis with a special focus on housing affordability, financial health, and small business. We're also pleased to report that the OCC assessed Wells Fargo most recent CRA performance as outstanding in both California and nationwide. So last year, Wells Fargo announced our $1 billion commitment to housing affordability philanthropy. Earlier this year, pre-COVID, we defined our philanthropy strategy for housing to include 4 goals. 1, increasing and preserving the supply of affordable rental housing. 2, expanding home ownership opportunities, particularly for minority and low-income communities. 3, fostering transformation and innovation at the local level. And 4, increasing housing stability. And then the world changed. So while all of these strategies absolutely continue to be critical in this time of COVID-19, we are focusing our remaining 2020 funding on housing stability. As you guys know, COVID has highlighted what everyone in this room knows, the incredible importance of an affordable, healthy, and safe home. We hear in the news every day the challenges for individuals and families who are homeless, who are overcrowded, and who are fighting to keep their homes. We hear about the unprecedented employment claims and the dramatic increase in forbearance requests. And people with the fewest resources to fall back on are the hardest hit. So last week, Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell reported that almost 40% of people in households earning less than $40,000 a year who were working back in February lost a job in March. That's pretty incredible. And as you all know, Black and brown people are disproportionately represented in that 40%. So we know all these things are not going to turn around really soon for these families and individuals, as well as millions more whose livelihoods, communities, and families have been torn apart by this pandemic and economic crisis. So what are we doing at Wells Fargo? So Wells Fargo continues to take steps to support our customers, employees, and communities in the wake of COVID. From March 9th to April 24th, we helped more than 1.7 million consumers, small business, and commercial customers by deferring payments, reversing and waiving fees, and offering maturity date extensions. In our philanthropy, Wells Fargo pivoted quickly to get funds out to communities. The Wells Fargo Foundation has committed $175 million to date, and more is coming, to assist people and communities in response to COVID-19. This includes more than 300 grants in California. Nationally, we have provided more than $30 million with over 600 grants just focused on housing affordability. These funds will help more than 100,000 homeowners and renters facing financial challenges as a result of COVID to keep their homes. And that's really what we're focused on right now, helping people stay in their homes. These grants support strategies including expanding the capacity of housing counselors, helping them figure out how to work virtually, better work with renters to respond to them, as well as supporting nonprofits that provide affordable rental homes and services. And when we focus on keeping people housed, we also know how inconsistent and fragmented renter protections are across the nation. So when it comes to evictions, I'm sure many of you know this, tenants are kind of set up to fail. In eviction lawsuits nationwide, an estimated 90% of landlords have legal representation, while only 10% of tenants do. So ensuring that low-income people have legal representation is a glaring equity gap. A Harvard study a few years back indicated that about 2/3 of tenants with legal representation were able to avoid an eviction judgment and keep possession of their homes, compared to the 1/3 of tenants who had no representation. Just having the representation made the difference. So one of the other things we're doing is inviting several legal aid and legal assistance organizations, especially in underserved areas of the country, to apply for funding to expand their capacity to help renters stay housed through services like eviction prevention, diversion, and mediation. We're also providing grant support to several housing policy and practice organizations to identify and support effective policy recommendations across the housing spectrum. And equally important, to connect and engage practitioners on the ground. And I think more than ever, the ability to hear up what's happening and then using that to inform policy recommendations is so, so important. And I know that's what's happening today. So unfortunately, before we can unwind the economic impact of the pandemic, we expect to see more housing challenges surface, and we'll continue to support strategies to help people stay in their homes, and look forward to the day we can start focusing on the other strategies as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, Dejan, it looks like your audio's off. So that's okay. That's okay. Why don't I go ahead and take this question, Dejan? Maybe no surprise to everyone. We did a little bit of prep before this panel, Dejan and I. So I'll just go ahead and take your question, Dejan. What Dejan would have delivered is, one of the things that we think about are, what are some of the challenges and opportunities you see, Eileen, in the coming year for local, state, and federal government in response to COVID? What are some of the issues that you think should really be kept in mind?
Yeah, so such a challenging question, and no simple answers to this one. I'd say we know there'll be growing budget demands, and that state and localities don't have the options for deficit funding that the federal government has. So we're going to see some really hard choices, and I suspect some declination in the support of housing. As you know, here in California, I'm not in California. The governor has announced an expected $54 billion deficit. It's kind of hard to imagine that won't have some impact on California's ambitious housing funding. DC Mayor Muriel Bowser just the other day announced some cuts to their Housing Preservation Trust Fund. Really important program for housing in DC. And we expect more of these kind of cuts on the state and local level, especially as tax revenues fall. As I mentioned earlier in the kind of responding about our philanthropy, renters are especially hard hit, especially renters without housing vouchers or project-based rental assistance, or who are not in public housing. Enterprise Community Partners estimates that 60% of LIHTC tenants have no additional subsidy. So they're in an affordable apartment, but it may not be affordable for them. So that puts those families more at risk when unemployment strikes. While prior stimulus bills address some of HUD's rental assistance budget issues, there has been no funding to date for a more comprehensive approach from the federal government. Funding is included in the recently proposed HEROES Act, which has passed the House but will be taken up in the Senate in, I guess, the near future. And I'd say the outcome is still uncertain about what happens on that. For any of you who are not familiar with some of those, National Low Income Housing Coalition has a lot on their website to explain that. In addition, though, some states and localities have developed or funded new or enhanced short-term rental assistance programs from a variety of sources. Urban Institute, National Low Income Housing Coalition are great sources for that information. Some of these approaches target landlords, more target tenants. Almost all have acknowledged the difficulties in assisting renters in smaller properties, especially single-family homes and 2 to 4s, but those renters are still really in need. At the same time, responsible landlords also struggle with being supportive of tenants while facing the challenges of meeting significantly increased maintenance costs, paying utilities and often property taxes, and of course, paying their mortgages. And even if they have mortgage forbearance available, for most owners of affordable properties, and you know this, Adam, from your prior work, maintenance, utilities, taxes are a higher proportion of their operating costs. So you're still not really, solving the problem. So that's a real challenge. So in getting back to our early conversation on the variation on renter protection and eviction across cities and states, I guess to me, a small little silver lining note, this attention to rental assistance and renter protections may help push for more consistency across states and around the nation, and elevate this issue in a way that, I haven't really seen before. At a minimum, I look forward to best practices and learnings that will come out of these many, many pilot approaches that are being implemented.
Great.
Also, yeah.
Thanks, Eileen. I think that's wonderful, and I think you do bring up a really important point around consistency, because I think that when we have a better understanding of what is out there, what's being offered, then nonprofits and community partners can better plan around what the needs of the community are. So thank you for that. Let me quickly, we're running a bit short on time, but let me check out one question that's come through early on. So one question I received is, just to paraphrase, what should smaller nonprofit housing groups be thinking about right now, especially for things like formerly homeless and supportive housing?
Yeah, so I'm not sure, I think for size, one of the things that is important is how do you have as strong a balance sheet and resilience as possible. So I think when you're talking to your funders, really pushing them, including us, and we're doing this now, to be giving you as much flexible operating support as possible so that you can be really responsive in that way. And, to the degree that you have, if you're a housing provider working with your lenders, whomever, to just give you that flexibility to be resilient. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure for, as people become housed, to not unhouse them. So making sure your voice is heard really makes a difference. Sometimes housing gets so technical that I think we lose the policymakers who aren't focused on it. And so really, I think how you're explaining that, it just makes good fiscal sense with really challenged state budgets to think about how you keep somebody housed instead of, gee, let me have them go homeless. Now cost a lot more money to everyone and obviously have terrible outcomes for them. So I think work with your local partners and some of the great groups nationally to get those, and don't assume that, those policymakers get that connection between how all these costs are associated. So that's one thing I'd say.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Eileen.
Sure.
I see that our second panelist has joined us. So what I want to do is, before you leave, I just want to say a very heartfelt thank you. I think you've shared some really great information for us. It's really great to get a better understanding of what Wells is doing across the country as it pertains to housing philanthropy. And I want to thank you for the great work that you do. So have a wonderful day and enjoy your afternoon.
All right. Thanks again for having me. Bye.
Thank you.
And before I introduce our next panelist, I'd just like to reiterate, and I apologize, we're getting a lot of questions, so we'll likely be able to not address everybody's, but I just want to reiterate, questions can be sent to adamb@greenlining.org, and that's how we'll be delivering audience questions. So without further ado, next up, I'd like to welcome Sonia Diaz, who is the founding executive director of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. LPPI is a comprehensive think tank that addresses the most critical domestic policy challenges facing communities of color in states and localities across the U.S. Prior to LPPI, Sonia served as policy counsel to Senator Kamala Harris during the first and second terms as California Attorney General, and directed voter protection programs for Democratic candidates in Virginia during the 2016 election. Sonia received her JD from UC Berkeley School of Law, holds an MPP from UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs, and a BA in politics from UC Santa Cruz. Sonia, thanks again for joining our panel today. I always forget that not only are we both graduates of Greenlining's Leadership Academy, we're both graduate school Bruins and undergraduate banana slugs. So it's always great to collaborate with a fellow slug.
I didn't realize you were a banana slug too. That's awesome.
We met 10 years ago, Sonia. So to start off with, Sonia, can you tell us a little bit about your work specific to the Federal CARES Act, which Eileen mentioned is the legislation that passed back in April. It allocated about $2.2 trillion to COVID recovery funds, of which I think about $350 billion went to small businesses. How is that legislation impacting Latinos in California and maybe even specifically in Los Angeles?
Yeah, one of the things that we did really quick to identify the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on ethnic enclaves is to assess Los Angeles County, which is the largest jurisdiction in the country in terms of population. What we found was that the CARES Act through Congress explicitly left out certain individuals. namely dependents who were enrolled in college and were over the age of 16, were unable to get relief, nor were their parents, but also mixed status families. So the CARES Act mandated that individual eligibility meant that you had to have a social security number if you were filing. And it wasn't limited to the filer, but also anybody in the household. So whether it was a spouse or partner or dependents. And what we found in Los Angeles County with the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge and my research institute, the Latino Policy and Politics Initiative, is that Latinos were disproportionately left out of the CARES Act. We've seen some relief in response to that from the state level, which was Governor Newsom's work with philanthropic partners to provide relief to undocumented families. That said, $150 million, which is the fund, really only gets about 7% of the households in the state and is less than half of what they would have received if they were able and permitted to be integrated into the CARES Act. So we're seeing policy that purposefully is discriminating against families, immigrant households, and I know that MALDEF has filed suit.
Got it. Thank you for that. Sonia.
So I'm wondering, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you for the answer. Transitioning to the next question, with new federal and state programs going into effect in response to the economic fallout of COVID-19, what do you want to see from our elected leaders?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think that nobody wants to go back to normal because normal was inequitable. And so when we think about how do we rebound or how do we recover, it's going to be on the backs of workers and it's going to be on the backs of communities of color. And they have least access to health insurance. They have least access to social safety net benefits, and they were already dealing with income and housing inequality. So if we seek to rebound and do relief, we actually need to target vulnerable communities, whether those are geographic communities or demographic communities. Anything short of that is not going to put us in a place where California can be the 5th largest economy in the world, nor is it going to get us to a place where we really are thinking about how we're better prepared for the next pandemic.
Thank you for that.
Great. Thanks, Sonia. I think that, as we kind of think about what's going on now, we obviously, to your point, what was the state of affairs before COVID was inequitable, and it was a system which really dealt some bad outcomes for communities of color. So as you think about your work more broadly over, say, the next 5 to 10 years, what are you thinking are going to be the big issues that you're going to be focusing on?
Well, when you say 5 years, Adam, honestly, I'm thinking I want my student loans forgiven. So that is like my timeline. I'm 5 years out.
We'll talk about that at the end of this.
We need to keep families housed. We need to build real affordable housing. We're talking about multi-unit housing with more than one bathroom and not 300 square feet. We need to think about healthy communities that have access to park space. We just released a report yesterday that showed 40% of Black and Latinos in Los Angeles County can't comply with staying at home and staying safe because their neighborhoods don't have access to food. Their neighborhoods are so dense that they can't practice physical distancing and they don't have access to green space. These are the people that are working on our front lines, keeping us safe, whether they are cleaning buildings or providing food, delivering gig workers, etc. What I want to see in 5 to 10 years are living wages. I want to see meaningful inclusion. I want to see an end to discrimination that's unlawful. But I also think that together, if we solve these problems, we're going to be better off. And I'll give you an example. The Great Recession decimated wealth for people of color. Latinos were the hardest hit of any racial ethnic group. Yet in those 10 years since the Great Recession, we've seen 5 consecutive years of increases in home ownership for Latinos. We've also seen that if they were their own, if Latinos in the country were our own country, we would be the 8th largest economy in the world. This is without tailored policy. So think about the return on investment if you actually center your policy decisions on us.
Mm-hmm. And Sonia, I know that Greenlining looks to LPPI for leadership on a lot of the issues that you focus on Southern California and around the state. What are some of the research reports that you think will be coming out over the next year that you'd like to share with everybody to look forward to?
Yeah, one of the things we're looking at is the unemployment insurance program. It doesn't cover everybody. So if states and localities and our federal government keep subsidizing and expanding that program, which we need to, we recognize that we're further leaving out vulnerable workers that aren't included. So we'll be identifying that on a statewide basis in California. We also are looking at health outcomes. We don't have enough doctors. California lags behind Texas, Florida, and New York. We need to do something about it. And particularly, we don't have doctors of color or language capable doctors. The final thing, and this is kind of our bread and butter at UCLA, is that we have an election coming up. And we see a second wave of the pandemic. And if we want policy change, that's really going to happen at the ballot box, because this is going to quickly lead into redistricting. So if we're thinking about big federal or state legislation, we need to make sure people can vote and don't die. And so we need mail-in ballots. And it's really hard. It's going to cost money, but I think that's the way to go.
Absolutely. And Sonia, I actually think you bring up a great point. So about 10 years ago, one of the projects that Greenlining worked on was ensuring that redistricting was done in a fair and equitable manner throughout California. For those folks that aren't experts on redistricting and might not be familiar with the term, could you give us just a quick summary of why you think it's such an important issue, and frankly, what is redistricting?
Yeah, redistricting is reapportionment. So after the census, we're in 2020 census, we use that data and that population to draw political boundaries. This is really important for two reasons. One, appropriations. There's a lot of federal programs that are based on the population of a jurisdiction, whether it's things like food stamps or thinking through community block grants. Now, it's also important for thinking about how we redistrict electoral boundaries. What congressional district do we live in? What assembly district? Here in California, we're going to lose a congressional seat because we just have not seen increases in population. That said, a place like Arizona may pick up our seat. Where is that going to be drawn? Is it going to crack or pack a minority district? These are all issues we need to pay attention to if we're looking for change and access, and not a new normal, but a new society that lifts up those that are really dying to keep us safe right now and fed.
Absolutely. And before I get to an audience question I just received, can you define those terms for the layman? What does packing and cracking a minority district mean?
I feel like I'm in a law class right now. So cracking is if you have if you have a ton of people and they themselves could create their own majority minority district, 50% or more is a majority, right? But you crack them so that they're less than the majority and they can't elect their candidate of choice. Packing is maybe they're dispersed, and that's where you see the North Carolinas of the world drawing these weird little boundaries that put in all the Black voters, even though there's, maybe 200 miles that covers. We see it in Texas too.
So shifting gears a little bit, one of the questions I received, and I'll just paraphrase, is that how can we leverage the economic recovery for clean energy, climate resilience, and good green jobs? So, obviously we have an environmental group and team that covers a lot of these issues, and we would love for you to speak to any thoughts you have on the Green New Deal or the green economy.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really clear about this pandemic is people don't have equal access to broadband, and that internet should be something that is actually a utility. And we need to start implementing the infrastructure in rural communities and other communities for high-speed internet. Those are jobs, and those need to be done in a way that are environmentally friendly and that have local hire. I think the government can play a big role in the regulation of that, and then I think companies can play the role along with other civil society experts to make sure that access is there, because we're seeing things shift digitally. Now people are going to school online. I was just talking to an elected official in another state. They said school is done. So there's no kindergarten to high school right now until the fall. They simply need access to technology. And I think that this is where we see green jobs going.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll just say, we do have some parents on staff who I know are now teachers and program people and advocates. So I know that parents right now in this moment are being asked to take on a lot.
Yeah.
Sonia, as we kind of wrap up our last 5 minutes, one of the things I'd love to do is, we've talked a lot about things that I think are really concerning and really scary. What's something that you keep in mind when you want to keep your spirits, or what's something that you want to keep in mind to kind of like, make yourself feel like it's going to be okay, and the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice?
Yeah, I think, Coretta Scott King said, civil rights are won in every generation. And so we're just chipping away at it, doing our part. We can't do everything, recognizing that this is unprecedented. And many of us know people who are sick, have been sick, or had unnecessary loss of life. And we're just going to have to figure out a way in their memory to architect a new way that our communities can thrive. On a lighter note, I brought my dog here for you all. She has left us for the couch, but I hope that put a smile on some of your faces.
Yeah, we've been seeing a lot of pets on camera lately, so that's great, Sonia. And then last question for you: where can folks visit to make sure that they get access to your reports and your research, and if they're interested in learning more about LPPI?
Yeah, follow us on Twitter at UCLA Latino. I'm at Sonia Francine, Sonia with the J. Our website is latino.ucla.edu, and we have some really awesome reports for you and content, and the dog will be there along with our amazing students who are online. So appreciate your support, appreciate the collaboration with Greenlining.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sonia. Before you go, thank you again for your time. I know that we at Greenlining are always looking to you all for leadership on the issues that you cover. So we appreciate the great work that you do and the leadership that you bring to the community. Have a great day. And next up, I want to welcome, actually before our next guest, and before I welcome up our next guest, I just want to remind everybody, if you're sending questions, send them to adamb@greenlining.org. I believe that's pinned in the chat section. We'll be reading questions directly from email. So again, that's adamb@greenlining.org. Next, to end our panel, we'd like to, actually, Dejan, do you want to do this next intro?
I would love to. I appreciate that. So to end our panel, we'd like to welcome Joyce Spinasse, who is the Director of Economic Empowerment at the National Coalition for Asian Pacific Americans Community Development, or National Capacity. Now, Joyce brings 20 years of experience working with Asian Pacific Islander community development organizations, including the several national capacity members in New York, California, and Washington. Prior to joining National Capacity, Joyce established and ran an economic development resource and design center in Seattle's historic International District. This incredible opportunity allowed her to work and learn from many immigrant-owned mom-and-pop businesses, which she hopes will inform today's discussion. It's also worth noting that Joyce is a graduate of my alma mater, the University of California, Berkeley, where she received a master's. And it's always a pleasure to say, go Bears.
Awesome. Thank you, Dejan. Joyce, we're so happy to have you on the panel today. Similar to everyone else we've had, Greenlining really looks to national capacity as a leading advocate for so many of the issues that we really care about, everything from home ownership to small business to support for nonprofits led by and serving people of color. National capacity is a leader on so many things throughout the nation. To start, what is National Capacity doing to address COVID-19 right now? Is there anything you're advocating for at the federal level that you want to see next in the recovery package?
Great. Thanks, Adam, and thank you, Dejan. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be here today. Maybe if it's okay, I'll just say a few words also just about national capacity for those folks who might not know us. So for the past 20 years, national capacity has been focused on community economic development issues in low-income AAPI communities across the country. And in recent years, we've really honed this focus to advocate on behalf of policies that prevent displacement that we're seeing happening all across the country in neighborhoods where low-income AAPIs and other communities of color live. So something that most folks may not know is that over 73% of low-income AAPIs live in America's highest cost cities. Over 50% of APIs living in poverty live in just 10 MSAs across the country. And many of these MSAs, New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, these are the same cities that have been most impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic with regard to the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases. But layered on top of this public health crisis is, of course, this economic crisis and this plague of racism that has complicated the current situation for many APIs. As we all know, the anti-Asian rhetoric has been at a high, and just in the first quarter of this year, there were about 1,000 cases of hate crimes, over 1,000 cases of hate crimes reported. So I'll just say that actually with so many AAPIs concentrated in certain MSAs, we are particularly concerned about this issue of displacement. And with so many AAPIs living in certain MSAs, that also means that AAPI businesses and AAPI workers are similarly clustered or concentrated in these same areas. So, what we've been hearing from our members is that mom and pop businesses are struggling to survive since not March when it began to escalate for the rest of the country, but really since mid-January because of, early reports about the virus coming from China. And so, many businesses have struggled how to adapt their business models. They've previously relied on factors like high foot traffic or cash-only transactions. And, this new economy is a whole new way of doing business. They're figuring out how to access EIDL and PPP loans, but being taken advantage of by predatory scams because they don't speak English. And, as many of us know, until last Friday was the first time the SBA actually released any information in languages other than English about the PPP loan. And so similarly, workers are scrambling to figure out how to navigate antiquated unemployment systems and also how to pay their rent. So AAPI entrepreneurs and tenants are both, before this pandemic, at very high risk of displacement, and this pandemic has only exacerbated the situation. So, national capacity is really focusing on 3 key strategies. And these have been tried and true throughout our entire time at Capacity, but I think even more so now. The first is, of course, supporting our members by connecting them to each other so they can share and learn. And honestly, just so they can have someone else who knows exactly what they're going through. Many of our organizations are the only organization in their area that are serving the AAPI community. And so they, as you can imagine, are inundated, but they also are trying to figure out, how do I help a monolingual client figure out how to log on to Zoom so that I can help them fill out this loan application? As a national intermediary, we're also shifting our subgranting to make things easier for them as recipients of our funds, and to also increase access to their funding where we can. And most importantly, in this area of supporting our members, we're providing them with access to critical information about what's coming out at the federal level. The second thing we're doing is we're uplifting the narrative about what's happening in our communities. We've ramped up our communication efforts to make sure that what's happening in AAPI communities is something that others know about and can become allies as a part of our movement. I think what we hear very commonly in a lot of the media is about, what is happening with so many communities of color, but AAPIs are so often left out of that conversation. And a large part of it is because the data just does not support the level of disaggregation that we really need to understand that there are some very, very vulnerable communities within our population. We have the highest rate of income disparity of any racial group, and that I think is really important for us to keep making sure that we're paying attention to the most vulnerable in our communities. The third thing we're doing is we're continuing to advocate for more resources and better policies for our community. We're working with Philanthropy nationally to dedicate more resources to make sure that they're aware of what's happening and figure out how they can become engaged. And then also with working with policymakers to make sure that they are aware of the issues. So I think that answered most of the question. Was there a second part?
No, I think that exactly answered the question. Thank you so much, Joyce.
Yes, and now transitioning. Well, one, I just want to say that National Capacity is doing great work. And as we transition to this next question, are there any issues pertaining to COVID-19 and the API community, that you feel aren't receiving as much media attention as they should?
Great. I have a lot of thoughts about this. But, maybe I'll just say, the first is that, and this relates to both media attention as well as to policy, right? The first is that we really want to see more of a focus on what's happening with renters across the country. We think that the HEROES Act has a lot of good stuff, but are concerned about who it's leaving out. And we know that there are folks who don't have a lease, folks who are undocumented, that aren't being accounted for in a lot of these policy conversations. And it's because it's also not something that our media is paying attention to. We also think that there's not enough attention being paid to the community-based organizations that are the ones that are supporting these communities in this crisis. As I mentioned, so many of our own organizations are the only groups in their whole area that are supporting the low-income populations that are in their area, and they're the only ones that have language and cultural competency to do so. But there's, so little investment in them. And even though many of them, even though the PPP was made available to 501c3s, we know from talking to our members that many were not able to access this. They were already struggling to fund underfunded programs and that are seeing more demand now than ever. And they're also innovating new programs, things that they never did before. And they're doing this on a shoestring with no funding. And I think that this is a really important story to tell. But I think specifically on the API community in terms of media attention, I think that there's been a lot of focus on discrimination, impact to small businesses, but I think that there's more nuance that needs to be incorporated around like who is part of this community. I think the story of South Asians, Southeast Asians, Pacific Islanders, like these are not stories that are being told. An example is, I think I just saw a news story that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders have some of the highest rates of COVID-19 confirmed cases in like LA, and this has not been something that you hear about. I also think it's important to think about what the cultural implications of this pandemic are going to really be on our communities. There's this human cost that we, of course, are all really concerned about, but what does this mean to our communities when we lose the businesses that make Chinatown, for example? If we lose all these restaurants that make our community so unique, if we lose the cultural institutions that are also struggling to keep their doors open, if we lose the artists who have really made our communities so special, and in fact are the ones on the front lines of organizing and activating and mobilizing their communities, this is a huge impact and huge loss for us to not be able to really talk about that particular cost. And I'd love to see more of that covered too.
That's really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that, Joyce. I think that one of the issues you bring up about, making sure that support gets to community-based organizations that are doing the frontline work is so important. It's something that we at Greenlining definitely are very focused on. I know that Dejan has written about it. I've written about it. And it's something that we really doesn't get left out of the conversation because so much of the social safety network has really been pushed off to nonprofits over the past 20 years. So just want to highlight, really uplift what you mentioned there. So we got a really great question. One person in the audience noted that Oakland has declared a health emergency for African Americans due to the impact of COVID-19. What could that look like in other cities and other localities where national capacity is based? And do you have any thoughts of what's happening at the local level, maybe similar to either this declaration of emergency or other issues that you want to lift up?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, I will say that I haven't been tracking as closely in each particular geographic area as I probably should be, but I will say that I just saw in the news, in the Chronicle, San Francisco Chronicle the other day, that APIs have higher rates of COVID-19 than other populations. And, it's, I think, significant. And I think that that's an important thing for us to consider, particularly given that, certain areas like San Francisco not only have high populations of APIs, but also one of the highest rates of API business ownership in the country. And, how do we help to make sure that certain places where there are concentrations of API populations are getting sort of adequate or commensurate support to the impacts to their communities?
Absolutely. And Joyce, maybe as a final question before we wrap, similar to what we asked Sonia, what's something that gives you hope and what's something that when you talk to young people, you would share in such a tough kind of time that we're going through right now?
That's such a good question. I will just once again turn to our members. I think our members, the organizations that are doing the work on this ground, give me hope every single day. They are just fearless in the way that they're tackling this work, and incredible problem solvers to figure out how to do what they do. And I think included in that is that they're being super creative in employing arts, employing creative ways of engaging people, and trying to also document what's happening, which I think is a really important aspect of this work too.
Absolutely. Well, before you go, Joyce, just thank you again for those great answers. National capacity again is such a leader in all the spaces that Greenlining and many organizations operate. So we appreciate all the great work that you do here in California at the national level. And we look forward to staying in touch on everything that we can do together. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So Dejan, do you want to wrap up the panel and give us some closing statements?
I would love to. Thank you for that. Again, we'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us today and having this important conversation. So much substantive dialogue has been shared today. Eileen, I want to thank you for sharing all of your knowledge for what we should be keeping track of on the housing side of things. And to Sonia, thank you for highlighting the pertinent issues you're seeing down in Southern California, specific to the Latino community. And last but not least, Joyce, thank you for shedding light on the issues within the API community that we aren't hearing too much about. And in closing, I just want to uplift something that Greenlining is prioritizing in response to COVID-19. We've collaborated with Black Cultural Zone, Black Women Organized for Political Action, and Roots Community Health Center to address the disparately negative impact COVID has had, particularly on the Black community, resulting in a recent publication of our analysis. If you haven't had the chance to take a look, the link will be in the chat, whether in the session or in the overall event chat. And also, Adam and our Health Equity Program Manager, Kelsey Lyles, offered solutions to fill the major gaps identified in the last COVID-19 relief bill. This will also be in the chat. And in final words are thank you everyone for attending, and we look forward to staying in touch.
Great, thank you so much, Dejan. And again, thank you everyone for joining this panel. We want to thank the UCLA Bruins, the Cal Bears, and the UC Santa Cruz Banana Slugs for joining our panel today. Eileen, we neglected that you went to mention that you went to Princeton. I'm not sure what their mascot is, but we appreciate you being here as well. I hope everyone has a great, wonderful, safe, and healthy afternoon, and we look forward to collaborating with you the rest of the day and the rest of the year. Have a great day, everybody.